was actually very interesting. In fact, as I thought about consciousness and how it grows out like a tree, I began to really think about that very first instance of where does even this first branching actually happen from. And for me, as I thought about it, I'd give an analogy about it actually. So, when you were a baby, you were inside your mother's stomach. And in fact, while you were in your mother's stomach, there was actually no idea of separation actually in your brain. Because in fact, you share the same air, you share the same nutrients, all of this. In fact, when you were inside your mother's baby, actually you and your mother could be seen as one being. And in fact, it's actually as you were born that your brain actually needs to all of a sudden start learning this idea of separation and separateness between you and your mother. So in fact, what we actually see is that this idea of separation is actually a learned process. Now, let's take it a little bit further. Your mother also came from a mother. So in fact, she had to also learn separation from her mother. Now, let's take this all the way back to the first organism that we see as life. Now, this life also gave birth to another life. And in fact, your life has a direct connection from mother to mother to mother all the way to this first life. Now, this first life had to actually separate itself from something. But what was this something? It was actually creation itself. So if you look at this whole chain of life between you and then all the way back to this first life, in fact, and you see that each separation was actually just an illusion that you created for yourself. What you actually see is that this separation from the actual existence itself is actually an illusion that had to be learned. So when I think about that and I see that that is actually the first branch of your tree of consciousness, the problem why simple logic and mathematics and all of this cannot describe any of this is because the root branch and the interpretation that first began all of life itself is this illusion of separation, and all knowledge that actually derives out of this, outside in life itself, first has that underlying assumption that you are separate from the universe. And it's only as you begin to destroy this illusion of separateness that you can actually see the actual inner workings of all of existence itself, is the way I kind of look at it.
Right. That in a way you're coming close to the Vedantic understanding of life. Yes, separation. In fact, the entire problem is separation.
Yes.
Separation is a word in Sanskrit, duality.
Yes.
The entire problem is duality.
Yes.
Dvaita. Duality. But the Upanishad says, in the original essence from which this duality has come, there is no duality, there is only unity.
Yes, yes. And this
it's from this unity. And nobody knows why, but it is so.
Yes.
You can't say why, but it is so that it is when this separation begins, you and me, this and that, and in physics when the separation begins between a particle and another quark. See, but in its origin, according to Upanishad, this separation really does not exist. It is one unity. It is from this one unity that all this separation, as long as you are caught up in this separation, you can't see the unity. Now this unity, in Vedanta, in Sanskrit, is called Tat. Tat. It's like a little bit same spelling as that.
Okay.
Tat.
Okay.
So, and if you can penetrate and get free of these dualities, now this can be only done inside ourselves. It can't be done through an instrument outside. If this duality can be got rid of in our own brain, in our own mind, then we touch that from which this whole thing has come. And therefore they say Tattvamasi. In true essence you are that, not this. This meaning separation and duality. That meaning unity. So from unity this whole duality has come. So it's quite reasonable even to think that finally it all has to go back to this unity. From separation. So how does one do it in the mind? Because we have only the brain. So first try to look at things theoretically as we are discussing now. Then say, is there some way of doing it? Then you see how our mind is so separate. I belong to this nation. You belong to this nation. I belong to this family, you belong to another family. I come from this genetic stock, you come from another genetic stock. But finally the genes are one.
Yes, yes. In fact, everything actually branched out from that one life to begin with anyways, right?
So, to theoretically at least to understand this, to a great extent gets rid of this separation in the mind for the time. Now yoga says, yoga meaning the practical aspect of the Upanishadic teaching, says yogas chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the stopping of the distractions of the mind stuff. That's my translation. Quite may not be totally wrong, it's correct. Yoga is the stopping of the distractions of the mind stuff, of the mind, or thought. So yoga says, if you can attain to a state where the mind is absolutely quiet, pin drop, like a pond with no ripples whatsoever, no distractions, no separation, no you and me. If this can happen, then perhaps you can trace the origin of that unity. And the seed of that unity is in everybody.
Right.
It cannot be, you can't say this chap doesn't have it. Everybody has it. Yeah. Because if he has separation, it must have come from some unity.
Yes. If everything is union, then everything is actually part of the whole.
It is also very interesting. Even physically, let's look at physical example. I desire to have you. Let's say a man desires to have a woman desires to. Now they are separate.
Sure.
They want to unite.
Yeah.
Why? Because deep inside there is this feeling of wanting to go back to this unity.
Yeah.
So physically they unite. And what happens when they unite? One more creature is produced. This again separates. Right? Yeah. So this separation goes on endlessly.
Yes.
So
but because of the separation, and because, ultimately, if we see that the separation is an illusion, deep down inside, we know that there's a unity, and that's why
that is required. Yeah. That is the basis from where you can go anywhere else.
That's right.
That's what I think.
Yes, and in fact, in terms of separation, the more I thought about it, in fact, for the very mechanism of life itself, it needs a separation. Because even for a single cell, it needs to understand that there is the cell, which is the I, and there is all the other, all of other existence that it can use to copy itself. First, it needs this idea of separation. And that's why I feel within life itself, it's so hard to actually see that there is a unity. Because the very basis and fundamentals of life require separation before the life can actually...
May I add something? Yes. I think the human being is the only creature which has evolved even to think about these matters.
Right. Yes.
A single cellular organism also desires to become two.
Yes.
It's called binary fiction.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Binary something is called fission, not fiction. Binary fission. One becomes two.
Yes.
The funny side is that I had a friend who wrote an essay in biology, short note on amoeba, single cell, and he wrote it like a short story. He said, once upon a time there lived an amoeba. Then then he said he desired to become two, separate. So then he split into two, and they lived happily ever after. So it was a biology class, but he wrote it like a story.